The second I stepped into the private room at the back of the restaurant, I knew my mom hadn't been honest about this being a casual family brunch. The lighting was harsh, the table looked staged, and a thick pile of documents sat dead center beside a pen I didn't recognize. My chest tightened when I noticed a man in a tailored suit already seated, laptop open, watching me instead of scanning a menu. My mom smiled like everything was perfectly normal and said we just needed to talk about what's fair after my dad's passing. My name is Grace. I'm 28 years old. I work remotely in tech, and I know enough about contracts, digital accounts, and legal language to recognize an ambush when I see one. Even so, nothing could have prepared me for hearing that the stranger was her lawyer, and that the papers in front of me were designed to redistribute my inheritance so everyone could benefit. He pushed the agreement toward me. My mom folded her hands, calm and composed, like she was presiding over a hearing. Everyone else in the room stared as if I'd already done something wrong. The lawyer explained that all I needed to do was sign and transfer most of what my dad had left me for the good of the family. When I refused, everything shifted. The smiles vanished. Voices hardened. They started implying lawsuits, credit damage, and how difficult life could become if I didn't cooperate. My heart was racing, but somewhere beneath the fear, I could hear my dad's voice, steady, reassuring, reminding me who actually had the law on their side. I looked around the table and began counting quietly, then out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They frowned, clearly confused. You're a lot of people, I said calmly. That's when I smiled for the first time that day. Funny thing is, I added, I only brought one person too. If you want to know who walked in next, and how this so-called family meeting became the worst mistake my mother ever made, keep listening until the end. I wasn't always the woman sitting across from a lawyer in a private dining room, counting people like chess pieces. Most of my life, I was just a kid from a quiet suburb in San Diego who believed family meant board games, Costco runs, and my dad's awful JavaScript jokes. My dad, Richard, was a software engineer at a small tech firm. He was practical, packed leftovers, drove the same old Honda year after year because it still ran fine. My mom, Laura, couldn't stand that. She wanted a house in a gated community, a brand new hybrid in the driveway, and picture-perfect vacations made for social media. When I was 15, the distance between them finally became impossible to ignore. I remember the night they sat me down at the kitchen table. My dad had printed bank statements spread out neatly. My mom had a Pinterest board of luxury vacation homes glowing on her tablet. She said she was exhausted from barely scraping by. He said he was exhausted from pretending they could afford a life they didn't have. California is a community property state, which meant the court reviewed everything my parents had built together and split it straight down the middle. My mom treated the ruling like an opportunity, a chance to finally step into the lifestyle she believed she deserved. My dad experienced it very differently. To him, it felt like losing half of everything he had spent decades working toward, while still being expected to cover alimony and child support. After the divorce, I lived mostly with my dad in a small condo near Carlsbad. It wasn't luxurious, but if I cracked my bedroom window at night, I could hear the ocean rolling in. Friday nights were our thing. He'd let me choose dinner on DoorDash, and we'd eat tacos right out of the containers while scrolling through Netflix on the couch. He taught me how to track expenses with budgeting apps, explained what a 401k actually was, and why credit scores mattered far more than designer labels. While other kids, parents bragged about new cars or upgrades, my dad proudly talked about paying off his credit card balance every single month. My mom went in the opposite direction. She moved north to Orange County, and seemed to reinvent herself almost instantly. She married Victor, a smooth-talking real estate agent who sold homes that looked like they belonged on television. Overnight, her social media filled with pictures of wine tastings, backyard parties, and perfectly staged gatherings. She had 2 new kids in her life, Mia and Ethan, and their holiday photos featured coordinated outfits and wide smiles. I was still her daughter on paper, but most days I felt like a background character in the new family she was curating. Scrolling through her posts felt repetitive. So grateful for my beautiful family, blessed and thriving. I was never in the photos. She didn't call to ask how my exams were going or what I wanted to do after graduation. Instead, she called to talk about Mia making varsity or Ethan winning another competition. The only time my name surfaced was during arguments about money. After those calls, my dad would come home quieter than usual, more drained, but he never stayed that way for long. He'd put on an old movie, pop corn on the stove, and settle back into routine like it was armor. Weekends were for simplicity. We hiked through nearby canyons or took inexpensive drives up the coast. Sometimes he'd point at massive houses perched on cliffs and say, "People obsess over places like that, but they still fall asleep with the same problems everyone else has." Our life wasn't flashy, but it was real. At night, when I worried that somehow I was the reason everything had fallen apart, he would sit on the edge of my bed and tell me, "You don't owe anyone your future just because you share their last name. Build something solid. Build something that's yours." Back then, it sounded dramatic, like something a movie dad would say. I didn't realize he was quietly preparing behind the scenes, meeting with a lawyer, updating documents, and making sure that if anything ever happened to him, I wouldn't be left at the mercy of my mother's version of fairness. When the divorce was finalized and everyone moved on, I thought the hardest chapter of my life was over. I was wrong. Years later, one late-night drive on the I-5 would take my dad from me and turn those quiet lessons about money, planning, and protection into a full-scale battle over everything he left behind. When you grow up with a dad who double-checks seatbelts and reroutes trips just to avoid traffic, you never imagine a car accident being the end of his story. But that's exactly how it ended. One rainy Tuesday night, he was driving south on the I-5 after staying late at work to finish a release. A drowsy driver drifted out of their lane. One mistake triggered a chain reaction, and by the time the highway patrol contacted me, my dad was already gone. The world went quiet in that hollow way it does when someone suddenly removes the foundation of your life. The funeral was small and understated, exactly how he would have wanted it. A few coworkers from his tech firm, a couple of neighbors from the condo complex, and me, standing there trying to breathe past the tight ache in my chest. My mom arrived dressed in black, dramatic and composed, like a character stepping into a scene. Victor stood beside her, with Mia and Ethan positioned just behind them, almost like accessories. She cried loudly enough for everyone to notice, clinging to people she hadn't spoken to in years, telling anyone who would listen how devastated she was. I stood near his urn thinking, you didn't love this man. You loved the life he couldn't give you. After the service, as guests slowly made their way toward the parking lot, a woman in a navy blazer and sensible heels approached me. She introduced herself as Alina, my dad's attorney. We sat at a metal picnic table outside the church, surrounded by the scent of flowers and lingering coffee. She told me my dad had been meticulous. He had updated his will multiple times after the divorce and had been especially concerned about possible pressure from my mother. That was the professional way of saying he knew she would come for his money the moment he was gone. Under the terms of the will, everything that was clearly his separate property after the divorce, along with everything he had built since, was left to me. The condo in Carlsbad, his tech stocks, Apple shares, index funds, his IRA and 401k rollovers. It wasn't extreme wealth, but it was solid and carefully built, the kind of financial stability that comes from a lifetime of discipline and responsibility. I thought I might feel guilty hearing it all belonged to me. Instead, I felt sad and strangely proud, like he had found a way to protect me even after he was gone. Elena walked me through the California probate process, explaining how the court would validate the will, supervise the transfer of assets, and prevent challenges unless someone had legitimate legal grounds. Then she looked directly at me and said, "Your father was very clear, Grace. He wanted you to control your future without interference." The word interference hung in the air. Right on cue, my phone vibrated. It was a text from my mom, long, carefully worded. She said we needed to talk, that my father would want me to consider the whole family, that we should handle his estate maturely. She didn't ask how I was coping. She asked when we could discuss the finances. At first, I tried to assume good intentions. I replied politely, said we could talk once probate had started, and mentioned that Dad had an attorney. She skipped right over that and asked for rough estimates of what he'd left behind, like she was evaluating a property listing. When I didn't respond fast enough, the guilt messages followed. She reminded me of everything she'd done for me growing up, how expensive my teenage years were, how Mia and Ethan would need help paying for college. The same line, repeated again and again. You need to think about the family. What she meant was her family. I forwarded every message to Elena. She advised me not to share numbers, not to provide documents, not to sign anything, and not to agree to private arrangements of any kind. And that was when I understood something clearly for the first time. This was never about grief. It was about control. Elena told me that if my mother wanted to challenge the will, she was free to hire her own attorney and take it to court. But based on how carefully my dad had prepared everything, it would be a difficult case to win. I chose to trust the woman my father had trusted, even if that choice meant disappointing the woman who gave birth to me. That was when my mom's approach shifted. The emotional guilt turned into subtle threats. She began leaving voicemails about how expensive lawyers were, how legal battles could drag on for years, how a messy court fight could even affect my credit. She would soften her voice with something like, "I'm only trying to protect you," before sliding in, "You really don't want this to turn ugly, do you?" It sounded like a sales pitch, wrapped in concern. The firmer I became, the more frantic she sounded. I stopped answering her calls and started documenting everything, dates, times, exact wording. My dad had always said that money disputes make people careless, and careless people leave trails. A few weeks after the funeral, probate officially finalized the will. The condo, the accounts, everything transferred into my name. Elena sent me a clean, organized folder with certified copies and a short, calm email outlining the next steps. Less than a day later, my mom emailed me too. The subject line read, "Family meeting." The message was filled with phrases like "clear the air," "talk through options," and "find a fair solution." She insisted it would be informal, just family. She suggested a nice restaurant in Irvine and mentioned reserving a private room so we could speak openly. I stared at the email for a long time, that familiar tight feeling settling in my stomach. My dad had done everything by the book, followed every rule, and still, I felt like prey being politely invited into a trap. I forwarded the email to Elena with a single question. "Will you come with me?" She didn't hesitate. Instead of replying by email, she called me. Her voice was calm and steady, and for the first time in days, my shoulders relaxed. She told me she would be there, that I wouldn't walk into anything alone, and that if my mother planned to play games with legal documents, she had chosen the wrong person to challenge. On the day of the meeting, I drove up to Irvine with a knot in my stomach and a folder tucked into my bag. Inside were copies of the will, probate confirmation papers, and a notepad filled with dates and summaries of every voicemail and guilt-heavy message my mom had sent since the funeral. It was my paper shield against years of being told I was ungrateful whenever I didn't give in. We agreed on a simple strategy. I would go in first, see who was there, see what they laid out. Alina would wait nearby and come in when I texted her. That way, my mom wouldn't be able to claim she'd been blindsided, even though that was exactly what she had planned for me. The restaurant was polished and quiet, the kind of place where the background music felt too soft and water glasses refilled themselves endlessly. A hostess led me past couples on dates and business lunches to the back, where a frosted glass door labeled private was already shut. My heart pounded as she opened it. I stepped into the room, the same one I described at the beginning of this story. My mother sat at the head of the table in a black blouse, posture perfect, like she was presiding over a meeting. Victor sat to her right, wearing an expensive blazer that looked slightly too tight, as if it belonged to an older version of himself. Mia and Ethan were there too, seated neatly beside them. And that was when I knew this had never been a conversation. It was a setup. Across the table, beside a man in a gray suit with a slim laptop open in front of him, everything looked staged. There were no menus anywhere, just glasses of water, a perfectly organized stack of documents, and a pen placed squarely on top. "Grace, you made it," my mom said brightly, as if I'd arrived early to help set up a celebration. "We just want to talk." The man in the suit stood and extended his hand. He introduced himself as Daniel, an attorney assisting the family in exploring options related to my father's estate. The way he said family made it sound like everyone in the room had suffered the same loss, like we were all standing on equal ground, simply sorting through shared grief. I sat down carefully and glanced at the top page of the paperwork in front of me. My name was printed across it. The page was dense with legal terminology, far more than anyone would casually agree to read during brunch. Words like redistribution, voluntary agreement, and irrevocable jumped out immediately. My stomach tightened. "Before you get alarmed," my mom said, leaning in with a rehearsed look of concern, "we just want to make sure everyone is taken care of. Your father's will didn't reflect the reality of the family anymore. Things have changed." She motioned toward Mia and Ethan, as if they were figures on a spreadsheet. "College costs are high. Life is expensive. This is about fairness." Daniel smoothly picked up from there, explaining that the document was a family settlement agreement. It would allow me to move a reasonable portion of the inheritance into a shared trust. Reasonable, according to the bold numbers printed on the page, meant roughly 65%. He delivered it with the same casual tone someone might use when suggesting how to split a dinner bill. I kept my expression calm, but inside I could feel anger rising. My dad had worked late nights, driven that stretch of the I-5 after dark, skipped vacations year after year, and now I was being told that honoring his choices made me selfish. "No one is trying to take anything from you," my mom added, which would have been funny if the contract in front of me didn't exist for exactly that reason. "We just don't want this to turn into a drawn-out legal mess. That could damage your credit, your future. This way, we handle it privately, like adults." I thought about the messages she'd sent me, the voicemails where her voice hardened every time she said the word fair. I thought about my dad sitting on the edge of my bed, telling me I didn't owe anyone my future. I took a slow breath. "So, I said evenly. What happens if I don't sign this? The room cooled instantly. Victor shifted in his chair. Mia stared down at the table. Ethan stayed glued to his phone, like he wanted to disappear. Daniel folded his hands and offered a look that was probably meant to feel reassuring. Then things could become more complicated, he said. Your mother could contest certain aspects of the probate. That means delays, legal costs, and everything becoming part of the public record. It could also affect your credit or limit how quickly you can move forward with the assets. Conflict takes a toll. We're trying to prevent that. My mom jumped in before the silence could settle, her voice tightening just enough for the warmth to fade. We're giving you an opportunity to show that you care about this family. You're not the only one who lost something, Grace. Mia is applying to colleges. Ethan has his whole future ahead of him. We're asking you to do the right thing. I looked at each of them in turn, the lawyer already thinking in billable hours. Victor, who had married into my mother's obsession with status. Two teenagers who had grown up in a world where I barely existed. And my mother, who could summon tears on demand, speak about love, and still slide a pen toward my hand without blinking. My pulse throbbed at my fingertips, but when I spoke, my voice was steady. How many of you are there again? I asked quietly, almost as if I were thinking out loud. My mom frowned. What does that even mean? I let my eyes move slowly around the table, like I was counting place cards. 1, I said, nodding toward my mother. 2, toward Victor. 3, 4, for Mia and Ethan. Then I paused, looking at Daniel. 5. The room fell silent, broken only by the faint hum of the restaurant beyond the door. That's a lot of people, I said at last, meeting my mother's eyes. Confusion crossed her face, quickly followed by irritation. Grace, this isn't funny. I smiled, and for the first time since I'd walked in, the fear loosened its grip. I felt grounded, ready. You're right, I said calmly. It is. I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and tapped a single word I'd already typed into a draft before arriving. Then I placed the phone face down beside the untouched pen. Funny thing is, I added, I only brought one person too. A few seconds later, there was a sharp, deliberate knock at the door. The hostess opened it just enough to let a woman in a navy blazer step inside. She carried a familiar folder and wore the kind of calm, professional smile that made my shoulders finally relax. Hello, Laura, Elena said politely. I understand you wanted to discuss Grace's inheritance. After that meeting, my mom dropped the performance entirely. She didn't cry or argue. She looked like someone who had just lost a bid on a very expensive house. She walked out stiff and silent, Victor close beside her, while her lawyer muttered something about reviewing options. Elena and I stayed behind for a few minutes, just long enough for my hands to stop shaking. She told me I handled everything exactly right, that I had every legal right to refuse, that if my mother tried anything else, we would address it. I wanted to believe that was the end. For about 3 days, my phone stayed quiet. No guilt-laced texts, no dramatic voicemails. I almost convinced myself that having a real attorney walk-in had finally scared my mom into backing off. Then the messages started again, colder this time. She sent a long text about her disappointment, about how ashamed my father would be, about how money had changed me. She hinted that if I kept being difficult, things could become very complicated with accounts and paperwork. It didn't sound like another brunch invitation. It sounded like a warning from someone who had accepted that kindness wouldn't get her what she wanted. I forwarded everything to Elena. She told me to save every message and not respond. Then she added something that made my stomach tighten. If she can't move you emotionally, she said, she may try to move you financially. That night, I sat at my kitchen counter with my laptop open and logged into every account I owned. And that's when I realized the fight wasn't over. I reset every password, enabled two-factor authentication on my bank and investment apps, double-checked security questions, and froze my credit with all three major bureaus. It felt like the adult version of barricading a door, one notification, one confirmation screen at a time. My dad used to say, "In this country, your data is worth more than the cash in your wallet." I'd never fully understood that until I was clicking through security settings with my heart racing, picturing my mother quietly entering my childhood address or my first pet's name into a login page. A few days later, an email landed in my inbox that looked exactly like the ones my bank usually sends. Same logo, same color scheme, same subject line format. Important action required. The only reason I paused before clicking was because the timing felt off. I just tightened my security, and life is rarely that obvious. Instead of tapping the link, I hovered over it. The address was close, but not quite right. One of those fake domains you only catch if you're already on alert. My stomach dropped. Someone hadn't just guessed my bank. They studied it. I called the bank directly using the number on the back of my card. They confirmed they hadn't sent any security emails that week. And worse, there had already been a failed login attempt from an unfamiliar device on one of my investment accounts. The representative helped me lock everything down even further, then advised me to file reports with both the bank's fraud department and local law enforcement. It felt unreal sitting in my small living room. Netflix paused on some forgettable sitcom, explaining to a detective over the phone that my own mother might be trying to scam her way into my inheritance. He suggested I also submit a report through the FBI's Internet Crime Complaints Center, IC3. That sounded extreme, like something people did when strangers overseas stole their crypto, not when the suspect lived an hour up the freeway. Still, I filled it out. I uploaded screenshots, forwarded the suspicious emails, and included the bank's notes about the failed login attempt. Alina reviewed everything and told me I'd done the right thing. "If this escalates," she said, "you'll want a clear paper trail showing this wasn't imagined." The next step surprised even me. I realized I'd protected my digital life, but not my physical one. During my lunch break one afternoon, I ordered a Ring doorbell camera and a couple of small indoor security cameras. The way some people impulse buy shoes. They arrived 2 days later in bright, cheerful boxes that felt wildly out of place for what they represented. Installing them made me feel both dramatic and strangely empowered. I walked through the condo with my phone, checking angles, making sure every entrance, and the area near the building's mailbox, was covered. It all felt excessive until I pictured my mother leaning over my mailbox or sitting in her car outside, connecting to the building's guest Wi-Fi, acting like the internet itself somehow owed her a share. That was when it finally sank in. This wasn't paranoia. This was preparation. For a while, nothing happened. The cameras only sent alerts when the mail carrier stopped by or when my neighbor rolled his trash bins past my door. Life slowly settled back into routine. Remote work, yoga videos on YouTube, late night scrolling through Reddit when sleep wouldn't come. One night, wide awake and restless, I posted a long, anonymized version of my situation on a legal advice forum. I changed names and locations, but I told the truth about everything else. The inheritance, the pressure, the staged family meeting, the suspicious bank email. The responses poured in. People urged me to keep listening to my attorney, Never meet my mother alone. Document everything and treat this as a crime, not a misunderstanding. A few commenters shared their own stories about families unraveling after a parent died and money entered the picture. Reading those replies steadied me. I wasn't being dramatic. I was being careful. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon, I was in the middle of a Zoom stand-up when my phone buzzed with a ring alert. Someone was outside my building. I glanced at the thumbnail, and my stomach dropped. The car parked at the curb was instantly familiar. Victor's SUV, the same one that used to pick me up from school years ago. I turned off my camera on Zoom, pretending I had connection issues, and opened the live feed. Victor sat in the driver's seat, engine running, a laptop balanced on his knees. The glow from the screen lit his face. Seconds later, another alert appeared. Motion detected near mailboxes. The second camera showed my mother standing there, phone pressed to her ear, scanning the area like she was checking whether anyone was watching. My heart slammed so hard, I could hear it over the faint audio feed. I watched her speak into her phone, then glanced toward Victor's car. Almost simultaneously, my banking app sent a push notification. Unrecognized device, attempting to access your account. Everything lined up like points on a map. My mother at my mailbox. Victor outside with a laptop. My account signaling an intrusion attempt. I hit screen record and let it run. Later, I logged into my bank's website and downloaded the access logs, timestamps, IP address, failed login attempt. The times matched the camera footage down to the minute. I sent everything to Alina, the videos, the login records, the IC3 confirmation number. She didn't text back. She called. Her voice was sharper than I'd ever heard it. "This isn't harassment anymore," she said. "This is attempted identity theft. They're not pressuring you, they're committing crimes." The next day, with her guidance, I filed a formal police report and updated my complaint with the FBI's cyber unit. It felt like crossing a line I could never step back over. But I kept seeing the image of my mother at my mailbox, and Victor hiding in his car like a teenager trying to steal Wi-Fi. Whatever this had started as, it stopped being family drama the moment they tried to access my father's money by pretending to be me. For months, I'd felt like I was always reacting, always a step behind their schemes. Now, for the first time, I had something they couldn't dismiss with guilt, tears, or excuses. Hard, digital evidence. That was the moment this stopped being a private war and became something a judge would eventually have to examine, with my mother and her carefully constructed life placed under the harshest possible light. I used to think courtrooms only looked like that on television, polished wood, heavy air, and consequences that felt distant. I was about to learn how real they are. But the real courthouse in downtown San Diego felt heavier than anything I'd imagined, as if the walls themselves had absorbed decades of lies, breakdowns, and apologies that came far too late. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Alina, my hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold without me noticing. Across from us, mounted near the judge's bench, was a large flat screen. That screen was about to replay my life in sharp detail. My front door. My mailbox. My inheritance. And the people who decided they were entitled to it. On the opposite side of the room, my mother sat beside Victor. Her hair was styled perfectly, makeup flawless, outfit carefully chosen to project respectable, not woman accused of trying to break into her daughter's financial accounts. Their attorney was different this time. Older, smoother, The kind of man who likely believed confidence alone could bend reality. Mia and Ethan sat in the second row behind them, dressed like they were attending a school assembly. They wouldn't be testifying, but they couldn't pretend they didn't know why their parents were there. When the judge entered, everyone stood. My knees wobbled slightly, like they remembered a time when they belonged to a child, not someone about to hear her own mother described in criminal terms. The prosecutor spoke first. His tone was calm, almost clinical. He laid out the facts: attempted access to protected financial accounts, fraudulent emails, coordinated actions captured through video footage and digital access logs. There was no dramatics. Just evidence stacked neatly on top of evidence. I knew, even then, that my mother would never be able to climb out from under it. Alina had prepared me for what I was about to see. I had reviewed every exhibit beforehand, but nothing prepared me for watching the screen come to life, seeing my own front door from the perspective of that small camera. The footage showed the date, the timestamp, a dull gray afternoon. My mother stood by the mailboxes, phone pressed to her ear, scanning the area as if she were doing something harmless, chatting, waiting, rather than attempting to take something that wasn't hers. Then the feed switched to the street view. Victor sat in his SUV, laptop open, the blue-white glow reflecting off his face as his fingers moved across the keyboard. A brief pause, and the prosecutor pointed it out. At that exact moment, my bank records showed a failed login attempt from an unfamiliar device. Next came the screenshot from my banking app, the notification that had made my heart pound while I watched the live feed from my phone. The timestamps aligned almost perfectly. It felt like watching a true crime documentary where the suspects were your own family. Their lawyer tried to reframe it. He called it a misunderstanding, said my mother had been checking paperwork, claimed Victor was simply helping with online access, suggested they believed they were logging into an old joint account from the marriage. He implied I was paranoid, emotional, turning grief into drama. I didn't react. I didn't interrupt. I knew what was coming next. Alina stood, composed and precise. She reminded the court that the will had been fully probated, that my father's accounts had been solely in his name, and then mine. No joint access, no ambiguity. She presented the fake bank email, the phishing link, the IC3 complaint, the messages where my mother hinted that accounts and paperwork could become complicated if I didn't cooperate. Then she played one voicemail, just one, where my mother's tone slipped enough for the threat beneath the sweetness to show. By the time I was called to the stand, the story was already unmistakable. My role wasn't to dramatize anything. It was simply to tell the truth, cleanly, clearly, like my dad would have explained a bug report. I described the staged family meeting. The settlement agreement slid across the table. The pressure, the warnings, the sudden arrival of phishing emails after I refused to sign. I explained how I changed passwords, froze my credit, contacted my bank, and learned about the failed login attempts. I told them what it was like to watch the camera footage live as every piece snapped into place. Then the prosecutor asked me one final question. "How did it feel," he said, "to realize your own mother was behind it?" And in that moment, the room went completely silent. My throat tightened, but I told the truth. I said it felt like watching someone reach into my chest and try to rip out the last piece of my dad that still belonged only to me. When all the evidence had been entered and both sides had finished speaking, the judge spent a long time reviewing the documents. The room felt suspended in silence, like everyone was holding their breath at once. My mother stared straight ahead, her expression rigid, eyes glossy in a way I no longer believed meant remorse. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost detached, but his words landed hard. He said the evidence clearly showed deliberate attempts to gain unauthorized access to my financial accounts through deceptive means. He explained that using personal familiarity and private knowledge to impersonate someone is not a family dispute. It is fraud. He acknowledged that no large sums had successfully been taken, but made it clear that intent and effort mattered just as much as outcome. He found my mother and Victor guilty on charges related to attempted identity theft and fraud. There was no dramatic, television-style prison sentence. Instead, he issued consequences that last longer in real life. He imposed substantial fines, tens of thousands of dollars, along with restitution to cover my legal expenses. He placed them on probation, meaning their financial activity would be monitored for years. He ordered them to complete a financial crimes education program. And he approved the restraining order Alina had requested, barring them from contacting me in any way for 5 years, prohibiting them from coming near my home or workplace, and forbidding any interference with accounts or assets tied to my name. Then he addressed Victor directly. He noted Victor's real estate license and formally referred the case to the licensing board. I saw the exact moment Victor understood what that meant. His shoulders dropped, like a key piece had been removed from the board. No license, no luxury listings, no easy commissions to sustain the polished life my mother had been displaying online. What surprised me most wasn't the ruling. It was what happened afterward. Out in the hallway, there were no outbursts, no shouting, no desperate apologies. My mother didn't chase after me or beg for forgiveness. She just stood there, staring at the floor, her carefully constructed life collapsing in ways she couldn't edit or caption away. For years, she had posted about how blessed she was. Now she avoided everyone's eyes, like she finally understood that blessings aren't something you steal from your own child. I walked past her without stopping, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to say. The judgment had already spoken more clearly than I ever could. For the first time since my dad died, the ground beneath my feet felt solid again. It belonged to me, not to my mother's version of family, not to her obsession with fairness, but to the daughter my dad had raised to understand that real value is something you protect, even when the person trying to take it shares your last name. In the weeks after the verdict, my life didn't transform into some perfect afterimage, but something changed. The silence in my condo felt peaceful instead of empty. I woke up without panic, without immediately checking my phone for threats or guilt-soaked messages. The only notifications waiting for me were Slack messages from work, emails about a new sprint, reminders from my budgeting app. My accounts were secure. My doorbell camera showed nothing more dramatic than delivery boxes and my neighbor walking his dog. It was strange how ordinary safety looked once I finally had it back. With the legal nightmare behind me, Alina helped me sit down and go through everything my dad had left, not as targets or numbers on a screen, but as tools to build a real future. We moved some of his carefully selected tech stocks into broad index funds, established an emergency fund, and set up a retirement plan that would have made him proud. Instead of feeling guilty every time I opened my banking app, I started to feel capable. I wasn't just holding on to what he had left me, I was growing it, making it work for me. I kept my tech job, working remotely from the same condo we had shared. Some mornings, I'd sit at the small dining table with my laptop, coffee from the nearby drive-through Starbucks, and glance at the empty chair where he used to sit with his own mug and a stack of printed code. It hurt, but in a clean way, like a scar that had finally healed. Therapy helped with the rest. I found a counselor who specialized in grief and family trauma, someone who didn't flinch when I said out loud, "My mom tried to steal my inheritance." We talked about boundaries, about how family is meant to protect you instead of burning you for parts of yourself, and how I could carry my dad's memory without carrying the weight of every poor decision my mother made. Slowly, the tight knot in my chest began to loosen. I realized I had spent years trying to earn a place in a version of family that had never truly included me. Letting go of that fantasy hurt less than I expected. It was like waking up from a dream where I had always been the extra chair at the table. I started showing up in different spaces instead. A local yoga studio, where no one cared about my last name, only that I always picked a mat by the window. A community meetup for women in tech, swapping stories about bad code and worse bosses, while supporting each other's careers and goals. Online, I drifted away from doom scrolling and toward communities that actually helped people. I reached out to a moderator on the personal finance forum, asking how I could give back without oversharing. Together, we cleaned up my old anonymous post and turned it into a cautionary guide. How to document financial abuse, protect your accounts, and recognize when family discussions about money cross the line into manipulation. With part of the restitution and a portion of my inheritance, I donated to an organization supporting victims of identity theft. It felt right that some of the money my mother had tried to take ended up helping people whose lives had been disrupted by the same kind of crime. I didn't broadcast it online. I kept the confirmation email in a folder labeled, "Dad would like this." As for my mother, the consequences imposed by the judge worked exactly as intended. The fines and legal fees forced her to sell the big house she had always flaunted online. Victor's licensing issues meant fewer deals, less income, and fewer posts about closing another dream home. Their Instagram feed slowed, eventually shifting from champagne and sunsets to vague posts about starting over and learning who really has your back. None of those posts mentioned me. The restraining order kept them away from my inbox and my front door. Mia and Ethan didn't reach out, and I didn't go looking for them. Maybe one day, when they are older and piece things together on their own, they will see what really happened. Maybe they will resent me, or maybe they will quietly understand. Either way, that choice belongs to them, not to me. People sometimes say, "But she's still your mother," as if biology is a moral shield. What I learned is that shared DNA does not give anyone the right to your future. True love is shown in how people protect you when it's inconvenient, not in how loudly they proclaim family when money is involved. My dad's real inheritance wasn't the condo or the accounts. It was the spreadsheet he taught me to read, the credit score he told me to guard, the principle that integrity matters even when no one is watching. It was the courage to walk into a room full of people who wanted to take everything and simply say no. If you've never faced a family battle over money, I hope you never do. But if you're sitting there right now with a knot in your stomach, watching someone you love try to twist loyalty into leverage, hear this clearly. You are not selfish for protecting what is yours. You are not cruel for setting boundaries. You are not a bad daughter or son for refusing to be manipulated by someone who happens to share your last name. In a world where so much of our life is tied to passwords, accounts, and paper trails, the most valuable thing you own is the power to say, "No, this stops here." My mother tried to trap me in a family meeting, thinking she could intimidate me into handing over my inheritance. What she didn't anticipate was that my dad had already given me something worth far more than every dollar she chased. The knowledge that real family protects your future. They don't try to steal it. Thank you for watching. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Justice After Dark for more real-life stories of courage, justice, and standing up for what's right.